Speak to the bill. Chair recognizes Representative Weiss.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in opposition to House Bill 5097. I would like to speak on this bill from the perspective of an educator, a social studies teacher like yourself, Mr. Speaker.
Representative, bringing in past backgrounds and imputing motive, or bringing in past backgrounds is not necessary. Please keep decorum in the House. Chair recognizes Representative Weiss.
There are several issues with specific lines of this bill that I'd like to discuss. While on its face, the bill purports to prohibit forms of race or gender stereotyping, it also contains language that would ban the teaching of anti-bias training and about bias in general, that structural racism and sexism exists, and that cultural practices rooted in racism could be harmful to others. It is worth noting, Mr. Speaker, that up until a few minutes ago, this bill contained language that would have prohibited teaching the unfortunate fact, and this is a quote from the bill, that race or gender is a better predictor of outcome than character, worth ethic, or skills. If that statement were true, as the language claimed, then how do we discuss and explain in a classroom the fact that women earn less than men on average for doing the same work? If their gender, in fact, has nothing to do with it, this language would suggest that the average woman has poorer character, work ethic, or skills compared to the average man. Similarly, because several minority groups have less wealth, higher mortality rates, higher incarceration rates, and so on, compared to the white population, this language would suggest, again, that these negative outcomes are due to a lack of character, work ethic, or skills, and that other societal factors based on race have nothing to do with it. Because I would never impugn the motives of my colleagues, Mr. Speaker, I have to assume that the flaw of logic present in this line was simply due to an oversight and perhaps a lack of understanding of the nuances of history and how it still impacts our daily life to this day. I am glad to see that this language has been removed a few moments ago. However, there are still several issues that persist in this bill. The bill prohibits teaching, again, and I quote, that cultural norms or practices of a racial or ethnic group or gender are flawed and must be eliminated or changed to conform with those of another racial or ethnic group. Again, looking at this idealistically, a supporter could argue that it says that no actions from a racial or ethnic group or gender must be changed to conform with another group. However, when you look very closely at the language, Mr. Speaker, this prohibition makes it challenging to have class discussions on the topic of racism or gender bias. How do you discuss Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, or the Rwandan genocide without roundly condemning the practices of genocide by the Nazis, the Ottomans, or the Hutus? Indeed, how do you teach about the horrors of slavery and Jim Crow, as the speaker before me from the 35th District discussed, without discussing the structural racism that enabled these practices in our nation? This bill also includes language which would prohibit teaching, and again I quote, that individuals act in certain ways or hold certain opinions because of their race or gender. Again, idealistically, it implies that bias is a learned behavior. Unfortunately, even though bias is a learned behavior, implicit bias, where people can act on the basis of prejudice and stereotypes without intending to do so, is something that we all start learning from the youngest age by simply living in our society. It is a real thing and something that we cannot ignore and pretend doesn't exist if we want our society to become truly a society of equals. I could go on, but the bottom line with all of this is quite simple. Understanding history, being encouraged and able to think and reason for yourself, being able to engage in class discussion and dialogue around difficult topics are essential to our educational system and indeed to our democracy. Lansing stepping into classrooms to prohibit certain topics from being discussed is not appropriate. Good teachers know how to navigate these discussions with care and compassion. Resources and professional development exist to aid educators in these endeavors. Let the teachers teach. Legislation attempting to prohibit Michigan students from having the ability to learn about and engage in these types of discussions is anti-education, inherently un-American, and perpetuates the status quo of inequality that still indeed exists today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.